IVM.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into A Show About Crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM Podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. Pallavi Aiyar, author and journalist, has led a life of wanderings all around the globe. As a student, she lived in England, worked in Delhi after that, and with her diplomat husband, Julio, she has lived in China, Indonesia, Japan, and now lives in Spain. From her travels have emerged books that are fascinating studies of societies quite alien to her own personal experience in India. She writes about the country's society, culture, behavior, and most of all, how she acts and reacts. Her latest book, Orienting, an Indian in Japan, where she talks about Japan and its beauty, but doesn't turn away from looking at its warts. How does she do it? Well, let's ask her. Pallavi Aiyar, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Hi, Sidharth. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you today.
Do you, when you move to another country, consciously start taking down notes from the beginning? Is there a plan in mind to work towards a book within a week of landing in that place?
Right. So there's never a plan to write a book, and the books have always emerged out of the experience. However, I'm quite a practiced peripatetic, if I might phrase it like that. And I've moved countries quite regularly every 3 to 4 years for the last 2 decades. And I've sort of developed a routine. And part of that routine is that the first 6 months to 1 year that I am in a new country, I tend to sort of experience the country in a very sensorial fashion, in an extra sensorial fashion almost. It's as though all my senses are tingling constantly. My eyes are actually wide open, drinking in all those little details that tend to become opaque to you once you've become habituated to a place. So, for example, the first 6 months, I'll actually read all the signs on signboards that you come across. I will be sitting on a metro and sort of see somebody reading a book and look across to sort of see what the title of the book might be. When people are having conversations, I often tend to eavesdrop. And even if I can't understand the language, there is something in the body language, in the way in which they might cover a laugh with their hand, or they might lean into each other or not. That is something that I will notice. I will look not only at the trees and the buildings, but down at the ground as well. And so, for example, in Japan, I noticed the absolutely fabulous artistic manhole covers that are so common in different parts of the archipelago and that make an entrance in my new book, Orienting, as well. So, it's really about seeing with a capital S. And drinking it all in. And usually at that point, you can't help but make comparisons with what has gone before you in your life. And so for me, my life has really been a process of acquiring multiple lenses. I have the most prominent lens, which is that of being an Indian, having been born and brought up in Delhi. But then I also have the lens of somebody who's lived in China, of somebody who's lived in Europe, somebody who's lived in Indonesia. And whatever I end up observing is being filtered through all these multiple lenses and is therefore also an act of comparative understanding. So, that's how I kind of go about it. And then I'm a reporter. I mean, that's my day job. So over the years, I tend to meet a lot of interesting people and get to ask them interesting questions and sort of look at the hot topics of the day, that whatever they might be in a particular country. And usually at the end of those 3, 4, 5 years, if you put all of this together, you have a substantial and interesting and hopefully informative introduction to that country from an outsider's perspective.
Yeah, but I'm just playing devil's advocate here. The dangerous side to it, the kind of negative side to it is, as you yourself said, that you become visually inured to seeing those signs. The cadences of people speaking are very much, you're practiced at watching them. So doesn't the kind of fascination begin to wear off, and then you become a little used to it, and you're not native, but you are heading there?
It's very hard to become native, in the matter of 3 or 4 years. But you are right, there is a habituation that takes place. But by the time that habituation has taken place, and, becoming habituated to a country brings a certain depth as well, because that means you then have started to put down certain roots. You have hopefully learned something of the language. You have hopefully read up to an extent about the culture. You have hopefully had some in-depth conversations with locals. And so all of that is part of being habituated. And that's in some ways step 2, when it sort of goes beyond the sensory to the intellectual. And I think what ends up coming out in books is a combination of those two. I always try to, put my own experiences and impressions, but go beyond just the impressionistic into something that is deeper and is also based on deep reading and an attempt to, have serious conversations and really work my way through some of the issues, identity and culture that are common to all the countries I've lived in.
Now, I've noticed that your skills as a reporter are put to full use. The digging of facts, the going and meeting somebody, the persistent following up, and putting the facts together. But then I find your academic training also starts intruding quite often. Doesn't that lead to judgments about a foreign culture? I mean, at one place you say, my antenna was very, very sharp about any Orientalism and all that. So doesn't that lead to, does it stops you from being completely open and accepting?
See, I think this is a very interesting question, and it alludes to the whole idea of an outsider kind of washing up in a place and writing about it. And what authority, what right they actually have to do that. I mean, we ourselves as Indians have been subject to all kinds of writing from people from foreign countries who come and, spend a few months and then write a book on India. And of course, it is patently absurd if that book, tries to claim any kind of authority or definitive quality. And I'm very aware of that as well. So that, in all my writings, I mean, there are judgments. There are, rather than judgments, I would say there are conclusions, because there is no point in writing something if you can't conclude something. But I'm very careful as well to say that while what I write is what I believe to be the truth, it is by definition, one truth of many truths. It is one view, and it is a personal, subjective view. And I always try to kind of therefore center myself and my voice, my background and my experiences at the center of the book, so that I'm not trying to claim a universality for it, but rather trying to say that this is what me, with all my shortcomings, with my own background, with my own lenses, have come to the conclusion of. So I will come up with judgments in the sense of there are observations and there are conclusions I will draw from them. But I'm also very aware that there could be contradictory conclusions or contradictory judgments that could also be equally valid. And I think that is something that I'm quite comfortable with. Perhaps it's my roots in Indian philosophy. I studied Indian philosophy for my first degree. But I have a kind of comfort with contradiction. And I'm very aware that just as about India, whatever you say can be true and not true at the same time, this holds true for many countries. But that does not mean that what I'm saying is not truthful. As I said, it is a partial truth, just like anybody's view of a country or conclusions or judgments about a country are bound inevitably to be partial.
Yeah. So you went to Indonesia, a book came out of it. I haven't fully read it, but you allude to it a few times. It was a bit like India, chaotic, noisy, argumentative, multicultural, all those things. But then you come to Japan immediately after, which is organized, understated, and keeps a lid on unpleasant things and on emotion. Bit of a culture shock, especially for you as an Indian. I mean, Indians are people who are loud.
Yes.
And Indians in Japan must be loud too, among people who value quiet. How long does it take for you personally to adjust to this?
I don't know if I ever adjusted to it. I've spent 4 years in Japan being hushed and shushed by various people. I've even been thrown out of a Starbucks, which I was thoroughly upset by. I mean, Starbucks didn't seem to me the kind of place where you need to be, which is very, like sanctified, like the inside of a church or whatever. But apparently I was talking at decibels that were too loud to be acceptable. And it's quite funny that you mention it, because when I was in Indonesia, a couple of months before I moved to Japan, I began to take Japanese classes in preparation for the move. And it was a, very, very grammatically complex language, the details of which I again allude to in the book. But I was complaining to a Japanese friend of mine who was based in Indonesia at the time about how difficult the grammar and the conjugations and so on were. And I remember this friend turned around to me and said, Pallavi, for you, I don't think learning Japanese is going to be the problem. The bigger problem is going to be learning to speak softly. And the truth of our words was unfortunately borne out over the next few years. So, I don't think that one ever really adjusts. And my attempt is not to go native as much as to, because I'm not even sure that's possible, particularly in the timeframes I'm talking about. But it is to develop a respectful, affectionate, deep curiosity, and to feed that curiosity. So, I mean, I think that, when I write about countries, my outsider perspective is actually quite a valuable perspective, and it's something that I therefore hold on to. So it's not like one becomes totally acculturated, but of course there are certain, you begin to understand the cultures a bit differently and become more comfortable with them, so that what might appear at first to be strange, exotic, or inscrutable gradually becomes more intelligible as time goes by, and you develop your own understanding.
So one of the things your book speaks about, how safe it is. Kids as young as 6 going to school alone, the culture of honesty, your wallet was returned, which you never thought could happen anywhere else. You were asked to go to the police, and the police immediately got into the act, and within hours after that, your wallet came back to you. So it's quite valuable as an experience. What were your reactions to these two things? I mean, to see a 6-year-old standing there on a railway platform and to deal with the police, what were your reactions?
Yeah, Sidharth. I mean, I think for somebody who's used to the kind of chaotic, crazy megalopolises of India, Indonesia, China, there's really something quite preternatural about the safety and sort of civic behavior that is so much the norm in Japan. And as you pointed out, my first few weeks when I was in Tokyo, I was constantly seeing little children, not older than 5 or 6 years old, sometimes with heavy backpacks, sort of seemingly wandering down a really busy thoroughfare. And I would chase after them naturally, assuming that they were lost and wanting to offer my help. And then I would see that they would pull out a metro card and sort of with great confidence make their ways into the bowels of the labyrinth that is the Tokyo Metro. And I realized that they were basically practiced flanners. They were walking and traveling and commuting the city as expert as any adult. And it really blew me away. And I think it was one of the areas that led me into being interested in what makes Japan tick, because it seems so different to almost any other part of the world, where when you have a urban jungle of like 30 million plus people, but with almost bucolic village-like levels of public trust. So that behavior was almost as though people knew each other and could trust each other, despite this patently not being the fact. And so I think what was very impressive, interesting, and what really sort of leaps out at you about Japan is this normalization of civic behavior, is this huge amount of public trust that people have. And it's something that I came to know firsthand because, as you said, and as I mentioned in the book, I actually lost my wallet within the first week of being in the city of Tokyo. And it had not only cash, but a range of credit cards from around the world. And also my residence card, my Japanese residence card, which was quite difficult to get and would be very difficult to get a replacement for. So I was very cut up about this. And when I couldn't find my wallet, and I retraced my steps, looked for it everywhere. And then finally, somebody suggested to me that I go to the local Koban, which is like a little police booth that you have every few hundred meters dotted around Tokyo. And I make a report. And I remember at first wondering, why would I go to the Koban? Because, again, being habituated to a place where you try to avoid the police as much as possible. The idea that you'd voluntarily go there for something that, what was the police going to do about a lost wallet? It wasn't even a theft or any kind of, there was no violence involved or anything like that. But since I had nothing else to do, I did go along to the local Koban. And lo and behold, almost like a supernatural ghost story, I think, as in terms of the likelihood, I filled in a form and they made a few calls. And the next thing I knew, they were sending me to a neighboring police station, 20-minute walk away. And my wallet was waiting there at the police station with everything intact. And somebody had turned it in. And this, of course, led me to discover these amazing statistics about how everything, about the lost and found system in Japan. So the police mostly, because there's very little real crime, and especially there's not that much violent crime in Japan. I mean, the primary job of the Japanese police is to give directions and to handle lost and found. And there's some staggering figures for the numbers of umbrellas that are lost and then returned every year, but not just umbrellas and jackets and things like that, but just, cold hard cash. And there's millions of US dollars that is turned in, that is found on the streets and is turned into the police and is returned to its owners. And there's something like an 87% chance of getting your money returned in Tokyo if you lose it, which, it really is like a preternatural story, don't you think?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we do know of cases of that kind of honesty, but you somewhere down.
This is on a consistent scale, Sidharth, which is society-wide. And, people behave almost conditioned by that expectation. So the expectation is not that people will take from you, steal, loot, and so on. The expectation is that people will behave decently. And that's quite remarkable in today's world.
But they are paranoid about foreigners entering their society.
Correct.
In terms of immigration, because they may not subscribe to these Japanese values.
Absolutely correct.
And
so you're right.
You kind of hint that there is an element of racism there. In fact, you say it, and perhaps they're genuinely scared.
So, I think that it's a combination of, genuine belief. And maybe a little bit of disingenuity mixed into it. But there is this sense that Japanese society is very cohesive, and that cohesion comes from a certain amount of homogeneity, which is quite uncommon in most other parts of the world. And they ascribe it to, for example, the fact that they're an archipelago and surrounded by water and, all kinds of other things. And as a result, that there is very much fear that opening up to immigration would disrupt this homogeneous idyll and would disrupt Japanese ways of doing things and the trust that they have built up in their society, which is why Japan has so traditionally been averse to immigration. I mean, if you look at figures for refugees, it's really laughable. I think they let in about between 18 and 20 asylum seekers every year, usually, which is really a fraction of what other OECD countries do. And while there is, the changing demographics of Japan, the fact that it is aging and there are no young people is necessitating a slight relaxation of the immigration policy. It remains quite unpopular. And there is a lot of debate, public debate about whether robots might not be better than immigrants because they would be less disruptive to society, which I think is quite hilarious and also revealing. But all of this is disingenuous as well because, Japan is not as homogenous a place as it might like to present to itself and might even have come to believe of itself. To begin with, while Japan is not an immigrant society in recent times, historically, it was made up of immigrants from South Korea and from China. Japanese people did not spring fully formed from the sun goddess as the national myth goes. They came from elsewhere. And there are fissures within Japanese society. You have ethnic groups like the Ainu in the far north in Hokkaido that were not given any kind of recognition as a separate culture until as recently as 2006. You have groups within Japanese society like the Borakunen, who are similar to the Dalits in India, which were basically like an undercaste of people that were kept physically segregated from mainstream society and were prohibited from intermarrying with other people in Japan. And while, this was outlawed over 100 years ago, that kind of prejudice still persists. And you have modern day people of Korean ethnicity called Zainichi, who might have been in Japan for 5, 6, 7 generations and continue to face a lot of discrimination. You also have a lot of ethnic Chinese that are still there in Japan. So, it is less homogenous, I think, than it often likes to present itself to be. And because it believes itself to be homogenous, it believes it cannot be racist because racism can only exist when you have a problem with many races and we are not multiracial, therefore we cannot be racist. That's, again, some of the disingenuity that comes into being. But I think things are changing. People are realizing gradually that more immigration is an inevitability and that modern Japan will have to find ways of adjusting to it. And we are seeing more levels of acceptance of foreigners in Japan. Naomi Osaka, who's half Haitian or half Japanese, has become a great symbol of Japan, something that would have been difficult a few decades ago when hafus, as biracial Japanese are referred to, were really discriminated against and considered somehow sort of second class. And as I mentioned in my book, we've had a few beauty pageant winners, a few Miss Japans recently who've also been biracial, including one woman called Priyanka. I can't remember her surname now, who I was going to say Priyanka Chopra, but that's somebody else, who is half Indian, half Japanese. And before her, there was a half Black American, half Japanese beauty queen. We had the Rugby World Cup in Japan while I lived over there. And the team was almost fully non-Japanese ethnically. So we're seeing a lot of examples now of a Japanese identity that is not necessarily tied to ethnicity, but it is much slower than in many other developed countries which have been more open to immigration and which have developed more multicultural societies than Japan has.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Security on a computer is like a layered cake, but no matter how secure each layer is, attackers and hackers are going to work tirelessly to find a vulnerability and exploit it. These cyber attacks can sneak into systems unnoticed, eventually gaining access to all the programs and files on your computer. Luckily, with Intel vPro, all of this is avoidable. Intel vPro has the Intel Hardware Shield, which adds protection to every layer of the computer system with 3 groups of security capabilities. Advanced threat protection, which helps quickly detect and remediate the latest ransomware and crypto mining attacks on the system. Below the OS security, which helps identify unauthorized changes to hardware and firmware, and application and data protection, which helps prevent memory corruption and malware injections. So, secure your organization's productivity with hardware-based security, only with Intel vPro. Visit www.intel.in/itheroes to know more. Intel vPro, built for business.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. There's a lot of space you devote to things like kintsugi, the art of preparing things to give them a new beauty and purpose, of the tea ceremony, of zazen meditation, which you take part in. And I think I loved your chapter on your description of kintsugi, where there was a certain stillness in the air, and then you saw this broken pot take shape. broken, pots and so many other things take shape. And those are, myths about Japan that all of us hear of and we are fascinated by. But these things are ultimately, they add to color and society, but they remain kind of peripheral, don't they?
I'm not so sure in the case of Japan. I do believe that there's a certain amount of romanticizing and orientalizing about Japan that has been common, particularly by Western commentators on the country, so that, we've all come to see Japan through a certain aesthetic lens. That being said, I do think that Japan is primarily aesthetic country and that a lot of its philosophy is actually based in aesthetics. If you look at India, China, and Japan, and I sort of look at them as a kind of great Asiatic triangle, and you look at the philosophies that are really, that take root in those three countries, I think in India, a lot of the philosophy is metaphysical. In China, a lot of the philosophy has been political, think Confucius, think legalism. In Japan, the great philosophers were really the tea ceremony masters, which is a purely aesthetic pursuit and had everything to do with, how you held the teacup, how you poured the water, what kind of seasonal poetry you alluded to. And all of this was, again, very influenced by Zen Buddhism. So there was a religious aspect to it. But the fact that, Buddhism developed in the way that it did from India, which was a very otherworldly based philosophy, to then when it went to China and it became far more practical as it kind of came into contact with Confucian ideas. And then when it went to Japan, you see the total practicality. Like Zen Buddhist monks essentially spent their day doing things and find whether it was cleaning toilets or whether it was sweeping up leaves. The whole idea was that they would work, very unlike the Buddhist Sangha in India, which was all about not working and seeking alms instead. So the aesthetics in Japan, which are very influenced by Zen Buddhism, then end up pervading everything in terms of what the culture considers to be important to itself and how it self-identifies, including, for example, the Japanese sense of their connection with nature, including all the sort of traditional arts or those, we are familiar in Chinese with the idea of the Tao, like the Tao Te Ching. So in Japanese, Tao becomes Do, which means the path or the way. And all the sort of traditional arts are like a kind of Do. You have swordsmanship, you have Aikido, you have Chado, which is the way of the tea, you have Shodo, which is the way of handwriting or calligraphy, you have Kodo, which is the way of incense, and so on. And, while these are very aesthetic, there's also this whole idea of what is important and what is Japanese. And I think a lot of it, and I explained this quite a lot in the book, was also this casting about of the Japanese thinkers in the medieval and early modern period for trying to find a sense of identity for Japan that was distinct and separate from China. And so this importance of aesthetics, I think, is also part of the search for an independent identity from China that we see in Japan through the ages, and which continues still today, even if, again, it's something that's become obscure to the average Japanese. But if you dig a little bit, you will find that it's been a preoccupation for hundreds of years.
How is India perceived you mentioned Bollywood, but that's at the end of the day, that also is a niche thing, unlike in other countries. And, Avara Ho, and I think there are others also. So, but otherwise, if you pick up a person on the street, educated, cultured, or just somebody else, how would they respond in a knee-jerk response? What it would be?
The Japanese are so overwhelmingly polite, and in that sense, so the opposite of the Chinese, who are so direct and don't care at all about being rude. So that if you were to ask sort of a knee-jerk reaction from a Chinese person about India, they'd say, oh, terrible place, poverty, too much democracy, no one child, crowding, you worship rats, very dirty. The kinds of things I've heard. Whereas Japanese would usually just pause for a very long time and say, oh, India, very nice, very special. It's hard to get a knee-jerk reaction as a response. There are, as you mentioned, certain kind of niches that India occupies. There's obviously the awareness that Buddhism comes from India. There is veneration, therefore, for it in a spiritual sense. Yoga is becoming very popular in Japan. There are these niche clubs like the Rajnikant fan club that I write about, who are quite hilarious and have chapters in all the big Japanese cities and have imported auto rickshaws from Tamil Nadu and ride them around the streets of Tokyo, but remain very niche. There's a sense, of course, that it's an IT power, and there is a significant immigrant population of Indian software engineers who now live in Tokyo. By significant, I'm talking about maybe 3,000 people or so. So, there's all of that. But I think really for the average Japanese person, going to somewhere like India is a huge culture shock. It is the other in many ways. It is as disjunctive as one can imagine. It is the chaos to Japan's calm. It is a different sense of time to Japan's, extreme punctuality. It's in many ways the other. But because of our common Buddhist past, there are, and other sort of pan-Asian affinities during the early part of the 20th century and all. There are connections, and there have been characters who have connected the two countries. So that while on the one hand, these are two cultures that are very different from each other, and I sum up that dichotomy as the Jugaad versus Shokunin dichotomy, which I am happy to elaborate on later. Mm-hmm. But while you have that dichotomous sense, there is an underlying sense of being sort of Asian Buddhist cultures where there is a resonance despite all of that disjuncture. So it's quite contradictory, but both are true. It is recognizable and at the same time completely alien.
No, you were saying about Jugaad,
yeah,
which, you've given several definitions to it, but I think in my definition, it has always meant make do and, sidestep the law and all that. I personally am not fascinated by it, but you give that as an example of Indian ways of operating versus the Japanese way of operating. So quickly, if you could just give some kind of brief.
So, I sort of bring it up in the context of how the India-Japan relationship remains very underrealized currently. And this is despite the fact that there are a range of political and economic reasons that suggest that it could potentially be a very important bilateral relationship because, India needs technical expertise and investments to develop its infrastructure. Japan has capital to spare. It has know-how to share. India has a young, dynamic workforce. Japan is demographically old and needs, young labor. And as I said, they are geographically and culturally close, but not too close, so they don't have any kind of border disputes or anything. So they should, on paper, be the perfect fit, but in practice, it is actually quite hard for Indians and Japanese to work together. And this is where this Jugaad-Shokunin dichotomy comes into play. And, Indian solutions are so much about finding the loophole, about the good enough, as you said, about patching the tear. And I think in Japan, this approach is considered unprofessional. It is a country that is imbued with the Shokunin spirit, which is the spirit of the artisan, again, very deeply rooted in Zen Buddhism. And it's really about the relentless pursuit of perfection through the honing of a single craft through a lifetime. So, for example, it's like the sushi chef apprentice who trains for 10 years before being allowed to even cut the fish. It is the sake brewer who at night only has dreams of yeast. So, a shokunin is someone who is aware that perfection is inevitably elusive, but still you do not give up on the pursuit of that perfection, even if it takes you a lifetime to do so. So, it's just so much the antithesis of the idea of Jugaad, which is what I think makes the two cultures in some ways quite incompatible. On the other hand, while Shokunin is very admirable, if you look at the current economic conditions, with globalization and the need to be able to respond flexibly to fast changing situations, the Shokunin spirit is not really suited for that. Jugaad sometimes can be better suited for that. And so, for Japan to kind of move forward and continue to develop economically rather than just stay in the kind of holding pattern that it is now in. And to compete with challengers like China, it probably needs a dash of jugaad in its own business practices, just as India could do with more than a dash of the shokunin spirit in its own. And, ultimately, Japan needs to become more flexible and India more reliable. And to me, to some extent, the perfect combination of the two is really China, that displays key elements of both a jugaad and shokunin mindset in its culture, which makes it quite a formidable opponent, both economically and strategically.
Towards the second half of the book, you move to serious issues like Indo-Japanese relations under Modi and Abe, and then finally coronavirus and how Japan handled it.
Yeah.
There's denial in the beginning, but in the end, because of their long-standing practices of hygiene and wearing a mask, they came out of it rather unscathed compared to the rest of the world. Mm. So the first half is Pallavi Aiyar, the kind of, if not wide-eyed tourist, just observing. And the second half goes into the business part of the whole thing of looking at where both countries stand on a more than one level. Was that some kind of deliberate plan?
Well, yes or no. I mean, firstly, I actually envisaged the chapters as being divided thematically, so that, each chapter has a theme, whether it is aesthetics, whether it is cleanliness, whether it is racism, whether it is the four seasons, India-Japan relations, politics, the coronavirus. So each of them have a theme, but there's also a certain amount of chronology involved because I am interweaving this with my personal story and giving a narrative arc to, as you said, Pallavi Aiyar, who arrives naive and wide-eyed. So at the beginning, I put some of those chapters which were related to that kind of discovery. And obviously the coronavirus happened at the tail end of when I was there. So it came at the end. Writing the kind of books I do, which are not a straightforward travelogue. It's not a straightforward work of reportage. It's not a straightforward analysis. It's a kind of combination of all of these elements, means that you need to juggle a kind of chronology and narrative arc with the thematic elements. And so for me, this just worked the best.
So departure is always very emotional. And even though you've done a few, leaving behind friends, memories, etc., and really daily living, but you evoke it really well. Must be common to you, but even then, I felt that, I did not get enough of, for example, how your children view each move, because they must get distraught leaving friends behind.
Yeah, so
that's just one example. You end on a kind of wistful note, but what about the children, for example, and the family?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it also depends on the age of the children. And this departure from Japan was possibly the hardest for my kids so far because they were, how old were they now? They were like 11, about to be 12, and just on 9 when we left, and they had spent the last 4 years in Japan. So they'd basically done their primary school in Japan, and they were very sentient. They had kind of become their own people with their own choices, deeper relationships outside the house with friends. And they had fallen in love with Japan, with everything about Japan, to the point where my younger one basically told me that he wants to be an astrophysicist, but not any kind of astrophysicist, an astrophysicist who wants to work for JAXA, which is the Japan space organization. And my older one told me that when he retires, he wants to move to Karuizawa, which is like a kind of hill station in Japan where a lot of people choose to pass the summer months. They're very Japan-oriented, Japan-obsessed, and I think they enjoyed the kind of freedoms that Japan offered them, what we talked about right at the beginning about the independence of traveling on public transport or feeling safe. They could really own the city in a way in which many other cities, including Madrid, they need to be accompanied a lot more, and they can't be flâneurs in the city in quite the same way. So it was very hard for them. And I think moving to Spain, which is where we moved, has been particularly hard because in some ways they've been forced to confront their identity or their lack of identity. They are half Spanish, but don't really feel Spanish. So they feel like foreigners in what is supposed to be their own country. Whereas in Japan, they were foreigners and they accepted that and inhabited that role. So yeah, I mean, I think it was quite difficult for them, but they are children and children are resilient. And I would say a year on, they are now finding roots here in their new country. But for me personally, it's always wistful. There's a lot of forward nostalgia that I experienced, particularly in the last year of being in a good country. And by forward nostalgia, I mean, not imagining the future when I will feel nostalgic about what I'm experiencing in the present. And this is something that, is bound to happen because your departure is imminent. But I'm always also consumed with a certain amount of excitement for what's next because, the world is a wonderful place, Sidharth, and I'm yet to find somewhere that I've lived that I haven't fallen in love with. There is something lovable about almost everywhere in this world. And so I try to see it as instead of a departure, as, an addition, a kind of one more layer of identity. I don't have to shed that identity. I will carry it with me wherever I go next.
So, yes, your husband is a Spaniard and your children are half Spanish. And you must have visited there a few times.
Yes.
But is there a book already simmering in your mind about Spain?
There's no book already.
There's a very nice throwaway line about how there is the power. There could be a power shift because you have somebody in the house who's already native to that place. So yes. So is that you? Again, is there a book bubbling over?
So, I never think about a book until I've been somewhere for at least 3 years, because it's only at that time that I think I know what it is about the new country that interests me, like how I would like to approach it. So there's still a while for me to go before I would even consider writing a book about Spanish. And my focus so far has really been on learning the language. I must say I'm struggling as I'm getting older. And the more languages I learn, the more I feel like my mind is turning to sludge and it's harder and harder to retain new syntaxes. But everything that I am learning currently, including the language, is potential fodder for something that might take place in the future. I do think that issues of identity come to the fore because of the fact that for the first time, we're a mixed marriage, a mixed couple, half Indian, half. I mean, I'm the Indian half, my husband is the Spanish half. But we have not, in the last 20 years that we've been together, been in a country that's been home territory to either of us. So this is a departure and a disjuncture and does create certain power imbalances and raises certain issues of identity, not only for the children, but also for us. So those are obviously interesting issues to explore. I mean, other things that are immediately fascinating to me as an Indian are Spain's medieval Islamic past, given our own experience with medieval Islamic rulers and, very different contemporary topographies, obviously, but those are things that appeal to me. The gypsies of Spain are, again, a fascinating group of people to explore with very little written records, unfortunately. But they identify strongly with India since their origin myth, at least, is that they come from somewhere in Western India. So there's so many, interesting things about Spain. And it is really at a crossroads between Northern Africa and Europe. And I really like those kinds of liminal spaces that are a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so I'm sure that, the next few years is going to be absolutely fascinating.
Perhaps you can find or write a haiku to explore your current frame of mind. You're
Yes.
quite the expert on the haiku style.
Did you notice?
Yes, of course. Not only I noted, but you find the exact appropriate thing. Though, of course, haikus have the habit of being obscure enough and abstract enough to fit several situations.
Interpretations, which is what I love about them. And ultimately, that's how I feel about writing the books I do, that they are sort of suggestive, really, rather than definitive. And, if I may, Sidharth, I'd like to just read a very short passage from towards the end of the book where
Sure.
So So this is right from the last chapter about, going back home, maybe on the last or penultimate day that I was in Japan. And I looked up my copy of Rabindranath Tagore's Spirit of Japan speech in Tokyo that he'd given in 1916 when he visited the country. And he began by saying, quote, "My stay here has been so short that one may think I have not earned my right to speak to you about anything concerning your country. I feel sure that I shall be told that I am idealizing certain aspects while leaving others unnoticed," unquote. How true this was of me and everyone else who had washed up somewhere and dared to write about it a few years later. To write a nation, to explain it, was always foolhardy. A more honest claim was one that admitted to bewilderment and delight, intuition and hunches, to vignettes and snatches of coherence, but resisted assertions of authority. This book was ultimately probably as much about me as an observer, my circumstances and predilections, as it was about Japan. It was best to read it as a haiku, a subjective suggestion of a mood, a tantalizing glimpse, a truth, yes, but only one of many. So that's the bit I wanted to read connected to haikus.
So basically, Tagore said something and it summed up your frame of mind too. But it's, again, I think it's a book which is very, very enjoyable, especially for Indians to know about a culture through Indian eyes, which is so alien from us. But we are still fascinated by Japan.
Japan holds a fascination, I think, for the outside world. It is somewhere that we want to understand, and it's somewhere that exerts a fascination and has a huge amount of soft power still in the world. I mean, from manga and anime to Japanese food, it's a huge soft power in the world.
Yes, thank you, Pallavi Aiyar, for the book and for sharing your memories with us here in this podcast. I almost, and more than almost, felt like visiting Japan as soon as the COVID crisis ends. And of course, I'm also very fascinated by ukiyo-e, which is their style of
woodblock paintings.
Woodblock painting. So there'll be many more who will read the book, and I think you've done a signal service to Indo-Japanese tourism. So thank you very much. And that was Pallavi Aiyar, whose latest book, because she's written several before this, is Orienting an Indian in Japan. Delightful study, but a serious book on, also a serious book on Japan, where she lived for several years. Join us next week once again with another guest on the Wire Talks. From Sidharth Bhatia and the team, this is goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys. Hey, everybody. It's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet is joined by Megha Rao, poet and visual artist. She shares her inspiration, her process, and the challenges around expressing the beauty and anguish of being a young woman. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by author and historian Manu Pillai. They talk about all of Manu's amazing books, including his latest, False Allies. Rushina Munshah Gildeal joins Sadaf and Archita Nankari. They discuss recipes from the mountain and discuss the cuisine of Uttarakhand. For all the last-minute ninjas out there, on Say No to Drama, Chitna calls out the habits you need to manage your time better. On Simplified, Chuck, Naren, Tony, and Shrike discover how rare diseases are treated with molecular biologist Bertie Ashley. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Inter. We appreciate the support.